Europe was sleeping on the 7th of November 1983, the Soviets began mobilizing their troops, preparing their air force, and transporting nuclear weapons to their borders.
NATO agents stationed in Berlin soon noticed all the movement and uncertainty taking over.
Earlier that day, NATO forces had gathered at its headquarters in Brussels to practice an unconventional exercise that went by the name Able Archer.
The objective of the exercise was simple: to simulate the outbreak of a global conflict and a Soviet nuclear attack.
The simulation was successful, and all parties were satisfied.
Still, nobody knew that the Soviet Union truly believed it would be invaded by NATO and that World War III was almost about to break out.
Empire of Evil. In 1979, the Soviet Union deployed 14 SS-20/RSD 10-Theater nuclear missiles, and NATO responded by executing the double-track decision.
This decision offered the Warsaw Pact a bilateral limitation of medium and long-range ballistic missiles.
However, the European missile crisis has still escalated.
NATO then threatened to deploy more than 100 Pershing II nuclear missiles to hit Lithuania, Ukraine, or Belarusia if the USSR decided to attack.
The disarmament negotiations began in November of 1981 but were aborted by the Russians.
When US President Ronald Reagan took office that year, Cold War tensions reached new heights.
The president was a firm advocate of individual freedom, and as a devoted Protestant Christian, he was committed to bringing down the regime that the Soviet Union represented.
His 2 terms led to an escalation in the arms race, with the Soviets serving as a deterrent to the expansion of communism in Eastern Europe and Asia.
During a speech delivered to the National Association of Evangelicals on the 8th of March 1983, the president reinforced his stance, calling communism an empire of evil.
He also called out the atheist Soviet state and told his people that the United States was not to blame for the escalation of the Cold War.
Quote, "I implore you to avoid the temptation of pride."
The temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and labeling both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
The speech set in motion an operation to deploy nuclear intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Western Europe, counteracting the recently deployed Soviet missiles on the borders of the eastern side.
Tensions rise. The aggressive U.S. stance against the crumbling USSR led to a state of paranoia and permanent alert among the Soviet military brass.
From 1981 onwards, the U.S. and its allies began psychological operations to test Soviet radar vulnerability and assert the Americans' nuclear dominance.
NATO then executed a series of ground, naval, and air exercises close to Eastern Europe to wreck the Soviets' nerves and put pressure on their leadership.
Naval operations in the Norwegian, Baltic, and Black Seas caught the attention of the Russian Navy and alarmed them, while American bombers would also fly directly towards hostile airspace only to turn back at the last moment before breaching enemy territory.
William Schneider Jr., once the former Undersecretary of State for Military Assistance and Technology, recalled the Soviet paranoia, quote, "It really got to them.
They didn't know what it all meant.
A squadron would fly straight into Soviet airspace, and other radars would light up, and units would go on alert.
Then, at the last minute, the squadron would peel off and return home."
KGB activity went rampant.
All agents from all departments were under stress to follow every footstep and every intent of their Western counterparts to uncover their fundamental objectives.
Their primary focus became, quote, "not to miss the military preparations of the enemy, its preparations for a nuclear strike, and not to miss the real risk of the outbreak of war."
The threat was so real and palpable that the Soviet leadership, especially KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, feared that NATO was planning a grand-scale attack similar to Operation Barbarossa in 1941.
Andropov, a World War II veteran and member of the Old Guard, took the threat seriously and executed Operation Ryan, an intelligence program to prepare the USSR for a first strike attack.
When Reagan publicly announced on the 23rd of March 1983 the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars program, aimed at shielding the US from nuclear attacks, the tension between the two camps exploded.
Then, on September 1st, a tragic incident took the world by storm and ignited even more fire, as the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007.
The civilian aircraft, which departed from Anchorage, Alaska, for Seoul, was spotted by a Soviet Su-15 interceptor after its crew had strangely deviated from its route and breached Soviet airspace without any warning.
After not getting a response from the crew, the Soviets treated the aircraft as hostile spy aircraft, and all 269 people on board perished.
The incident led to an escalation of anti-Soviet sentiment, but the crisis was far from over.
Bruce Blair, former president of the World Security Institute, said that 5/11, quote, the USSR was geared to expect an attack and to retaliate very quickly against it.
It was on hair-trigger alert.
It was very nerve-wracking and prone to mistakes and accidents.
The false alarm could not have come at a more dangerous or intense phase in US-Soviet relations.
I think that this is the closest our country has come to an accidental nuclear war.
Archer Abel, age 83, on the 7th of November 1983, over 100 military officers gathered at the main NATO headquarters in Brussels to execute a unique military exercise.
The objective was to simulate a Soviet nuclear attack and unofficially prepare in case World War III exploded.
The exercise was called Able Archer 83, and it was part of the massive conventional exercise codenamed Autumn Force.
Each year, tens of thousands of NATO soldiers gather to perform these exercises, but this time was different.
Tensions between the two blocs ran high, and the destruction of Flight 007 showed how much the Soviets were ready for an enemy attack.
The fictional scenario had Yugoslavia, which was not part of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, wanting to join the Western nations.
Fearing that this move would have a domino effect on other Eastern European countries that would decide to join NATO and leave the Warsaw Pact, Russia firmly said no and sent their armored cavalry into Yugoslavia.
Afterward, the Soviets would invade the rest of Western Europe, pushing back NATO forces before the organization authorized nuclear missiles to stop the enemy's advance.
The wargame then concluded with NATO wiping out the city of Kiev to warn the Russians that they were serious and ready to escalate the conflict.
Ground troops were deployed during the drill.
US bases practiced weapons drills, and aircraft flew sorties.
Additionally, NATO used encrypted communications and long hours of radio silence to disorient the Soviets.
After the drill, the NATO officers congratulated themselves on a job well done, but the Soviets and the NATO agents stationed at Devil's Mountain in Berlin were on high alert.
Also known as Field Station Berlin, Devil's Mountain was a hidden spy base in the forests of Germany's capital.
Here, agents spied upon the Soviets in a global surveillance operation and monitored every Soviet move around Eastern Germany and other parts of Europe.
However, during Operation Able Archer, something unexpected happened.
It's not a drill because of the inherent paranoia of the time. The Soviets believed that NATO's Able Archer exercise was a real threat and began a large-scale military operation to retaliate.
Communication points across East Germany and Eastern Europe suddenly lit up, and the agents in Berlin thought it was a training exercise.
They didn't know the Soviets' intention at the time, and spent the whole night trying to figure out what they were up to.
World War III was about to break out because of a single military exercise, and nobody knew about it, even the United States intelligence.
It was the closest the world came to a global catastrophe, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
The Soviets mobilized entire divisions, transported nuclear weapons to their borders, and mustered their air force to attack critical targets across Western Europe.
Fortunately, they eventually realized what had really happened and stopped short of attacking.
It wasn't until the 1990s that declassified information from the US government showed how close the world came to nuclear war after the competition of Able Archer 83.
One of the many disclosed documents came from Minister of Defense Dmitry Ustinov, who wrote about the event after a few days had passed. The dangerous nature of the military exercises conducted by the US and NATO in recent years commands attention.
These exercises are characterized by an enormous scope, and they are becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from a real deployment of armed forces for aggression.
He concluded his statement by saying, "We are also obliged to draw appropriate conclusions from the fact that the US has deployed armed forces groupings prepared for war near the Soviet Union's borders and has created control systems for them."
We have to reckon with the ever-growing scope and dangerous nature of the strategic offensive forces exercises conducted by the American Command, as well as exercises conducted in a NATO framework.
The Soviet war scare was real and was one of several reasons the US and the USSR signed a nuclear arms treaty in 1987.
Thank you for watching our video.